Hey everyone, this is Ed Gutowski. What I want to do is I wanted to create a little lecture where I introduce you to the key concepts of our class, because our class is going to focus on rhetoric and argument. So what you're going to find throughout the term is I'm going to create some mini lectures that I'll post. Our class will never meet at one set time. We don't have any Zoom meetings. I'm basically just going to set up some lectures that I'll record and post. And these are kind of the same lectures you'd receive if we were in a ground class. So we know that English 302 is a class that focuses on rhetoric and argument. Rhetoric and argument is always loads of fun. But before we can talk about argument, the first thing we have to do is we have to talk about rhetoric. Because rhetoric and argument are linked. You can't have one without the other. So before we can talk about argument, we have to talk about rhetoric. So in a ground class, what I would normally do is just pose the question, what is rhetoric? And generally I'd get three responses from students. First, you'd get the students who panic, they look like they're about ready to cry, and they're thinking about dropping the class. They've never heard the term rhetoric before. Then you get some students who said they've heard the term rhetoric, but they're not really sure what it means. And every once in a while you get a few brave souls who think they can actually define what rhetoric is. So if you're in that first position where you've never heard the term rhetoric, you're in the right spot, because what I'm going to go through this lecture is just kind of walk you through kind of the 3 steps of helping you to understand rhetoric. And then by the end, I'll give you kind of a definition of rhetoric. So in order for us to understand what rhetoric is, the first thing we have to do is we have to talk about the people who use rhetoric, because it's safe to assume that there are people who use rhetoric. And in a ground class, when I can ask students, well, who are the people who use rhetoric? Every single ground class, I could have students who've never heard the term rhetoric before, but they can always say that the people who use rhetoric are politicians. Politicians are always associated with rhetoric. And if you think about it, we just got out of a nasty political campaign. And somewhere along the course, you might have heard someone say Donald Trump is using rhetoric, or you might have heard Joe Biden is using rhetoric. So you'd heard the term, you don't know what it really means, but we know that politicians use rhetoric. The second group that's always associated with rhetoric is lawyers. Students always say, well, lawyers are known for rhetoric. And then if we go further down the list, we might talk about writers. Some students will say, well, writers are known to use rhetoric. Someone will say teachers use rhetoric. I always like to point out, well, if teachers use rhetoric, then so do students, and they're not very good at it. So once we've established, okay, we know that there are people who use rhetoric, now I want to talk about forms of rhetoric. And in a ground class, I always say, well, look, if we know that politicians use rhetoric, I have a guest speaker, and imagine if right now over my shoulder, former President Barack Obama just popped up. And you saw Obama, hi Obama, right? And we know that Obama uses rhetoric. So he's a politician, what is Obama doing? And students will say, well, he's talking. What's he specifically doing? He's giving a speech. So a speech could be a form of rhetoric. And I always ask students, well, how many people have seen former President Obama speak? I used to get, some students who actually had seen him speak, they'd served in the military, but for the most part, people would say, they haven't seen Barack Obama speak live in person. I say, well, how's that possible? And someone will say TV. Well, then notice a form of rhetoric might be TV. And if TV is a form of rhetoric, that might mean something like radio is a form of rhetoric, the internet is a form of rhetoric, emails could be a form of rhetoric, technology could be a form of rhetoric, right? Facebook could be a form of rhetoric. If we go back to thinking about the people who use rhetoric, if a writer is using a form of rhetoric, if a writer is the person that's using rhetoric, his form of rhetoric might be a book. If we call a writer a journalist, his form of rhetoric might be a newspaper. So look, all we've done is we've said, there are people who use rhetoric, politicians, lawyers, writers, teachers. There are forms of rhetoric, speech, TV, radio, technology, Facebook, the internet. I'm going to give you my definition of rhetoric. And my definition of rhetoric is words that are used to manipulate, to deceive, and con people. So throughout the next couple of weeks, I'm going to define rhetoric as words that are used to manipulate, deceive, and con people. And what you're going to do right now is, there are 2 other videos that'll go into probably a little more detail about rhetoric, so you kind of get a better understanding of it. And then there's this kind of a discussion board based on this video And the other videos will kind of ask you how you would define rhetoric and why. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what you have to say. And this is kind of going to be the start of our class. It's going to be a lot of fun.